Hello, my name is Dan Gwynn of FrancisSchaefferStudies.org, and I'm here with Dr. Calhoun of Covenant Theological Seminary. We'd like to speak with him today a little bit about Francis Schaeffer and his time with him. And so, Dr. Calhoun, I'd like to open with a question for you. How did you first meet Dr. Francis Schaeffer?
I came as a student to Covenant Seminary a long time ago, about 50 years ago, actually. And Francis Schaeffer came occasionally through my seminary years. He was already in Switzerland, working in a ministry with children, but at the same time beginning L'Abri.
Okay.
And Schaeffer would travel to the United States about every year to lecture at Covenant. So he was one of my first teachers at the seminary.
Really? Well, that's wonderful. If you could tell me, what was your first impression of Dr. Schaeffer?
He was a very unusual man.
Really?
And he wore knickerbockers when he came to teach. He had a beard then very much like yours, and had an unusual voice. He was a little bit hard to understand, but very gripping in his presentations. He was unusual. He said things in a different sort of way, and that was good because we were then trying to figure out what he meant and what he was saying, and it made us think.
Yeah. Now you say that he was one of your first teachers.
Yes.
Was that in a class format?
Yes, it was in a class. We would have Schaeffer for maybe a week, in which he would lecture every day. Classes were called different titles, but Dr. Schaeffer on some theological topic, on the Bible, on culture, on various things that he was interested in.
How did you finally end up at L'Abri? As I understand, you went to study at L'Abri at some point.
I did. I was there for a summer. I had known Schaeffer at Covenant. Then I graduated from Covenant, went to a Bible college in South Carolina, Columbia Bible College, to teach. And I was teaching there. And one summer, I was able to go with my wife, and we had a son and a little boy, to L'Abri. I had met John Sandry. He was a Covenant student, Dr. Schaeffer's son-in-law, married to Priscilla. They were good friends of ours. And so John and Priscilla helped to arrange for us to come. We rented a chalet just up the road from L'Abri, called Chalet Bambi. And we lived there for that summer, and I studied with Schaeffer, mainly listening to tapes from Schaeffer and Rookmacher and some of the other people that Schaeffer was associated with in Farrell House, the church and study center at L'Abri, and then attending the evening discussions with Schaeffer. L'Abri was still small in those days, so Dr. Schaeffer was very much around, and we got to see him all the time and talk to him a lot.
Okay, and what year was that?
That was 1964.
64, okay. That's wonderful to hear. Now, what was your most memorable moment with Dr. Schaeffer?
Dr. Schaeffer would, about once every couple of weeks, invite me to go for a walk. And we would go from Weymouth to Panay along a beautiful road in Switzerland, Canton of Vaud. And we'd have tea together in a little tea room in Panay, and we'd walk back. I was always, at least at first, I was kind of nervous about those walks, because what Schaeffer was going to do was ask me what I had studied and what I had learned, and I was not sure I could hold up my end of the conversation, so I felt a little intimidated by having to walk all the way to Panay with this man and all the way back, and not sure how I was going to do. But I pretty soon discovered, and this was my most memorable moment, that Dr. Schaeffer was, of course, interested in academic things, intellectual things, questions, and wanted to discuss things like that. But he was more interested in a person's spiritual life. And along the way, in that walk, he would point out from time to time places where he had taken other people and how different people that had walked that path with him had made really wonderful decisions for Christ along the way, to accept Christ as Savior, to give one's life as a missionary. And he would say, under that tree, something happened. On that rock, another person came back to the Lord, something like that. So I pretty soon learned to relax with Schaeffer and enjoy my times with him. But mainly it was a time of spiritual nourishment as well as intellectual stimulation.
So in many ways, that those walks in the Swiss Alps were it had its own character and testimony, didn't it?
Absolutely.
Wow. And then also, I understand, Schaeffer was a short guy, and I know you're kind of a tall guy, but I understand he walked pretty fast.
Oh, he walked fast. He walked fast. I had to learn to walk fast. We didn't loiter. We walked, and that was good too. But wonderful experience.
Wonderful experience, keeping up with him. So now there's this story about you and Dr. Schaeffer in which you witnessed him shedding tears after seeing two differing parties in the church who were agreeing to go and have prayer together.
Yes.
And can you tell us a little bit about that event?
That was at the first Lausanne Congress.
Okay, yeah.
In Lausanne, Switzerland. I was a delegate to that Congress from the United States, and many people were there, sponsored by Billy Graham, John Stott, and others were leading that conference. One day I saw Dr. Schaeffer, and of course we knew each other from Covenant and from L'Abri, and we started talking. He invited me to sit with him that night.
Wow.
Malcolm Muggeridge was to give the address. He had just converted from atheism to Christianity.
Oh yeah, I've seen clips of that.
Right. Very important evening for us, and we were eager to hear what Malcolm Muggeridge was going to say. But before the address, different announcements were being flashed on a large screen about various meetings and different things that were taking place that day and the next day at the Congress. And there was one announcement that said members of the Presbyterian Church in America and of the Presbyterian Church in the United States, that was the new PCA and the old Southern Presbyterian Church.
Okay.
People from those two denominations would meet together for prayer at a prayer meeting that evening or the next day. I was interested in that, but I didn't think too much about it until I looked over to Dr. Schaeffer and was going to make some kind of comment about it. And he was crying. There were tears coming out of his eyes, and he said something like, "That's the way it ought to be." We made a big mistake when we came out of the Northern Presbyterian Church in not allowing ourselves to be generous with our brothers who stayed in.
Yeah.
Like Dr. Barnhouse at 10th Presbyterian in Philadelphia, who had remained in the PCUSA and did not come out with Machen and Schaeffer and Buslow and the others. He said that's the way it ought to be done.
Yeah.
That shows real love,
Yeah.
real concern for each other. We don't always precisely agree, but we still should show love and compassion for each other.
As a follow-up to that, then, I understand that, he really kind of decided over time that, the separatist movement that he had been involved in were kind of things that he just wasn't really proud of.
Well, that was right. Yes, he said you've got to draw the line in the right place. And not only should you stand for purity of the truth, but observable love. So as these things happen in church history, stand for the truth, but love everybody.
Yeah, exactly. Wow. So now I read a paper of yours. It's from Ancient and Medieval Church History, where you comment on Francis take on Aquinas. And it's in lesson 29 on page 7, and you state, Thomas may reduce the human part in salvation to 1% and attribute 99% to God, but in the end, it's still a percentage theology. Can you tell me a little bit about Schaeffer's perspective on Aquinas, and then elaborate on your evaluation of it?
I find Thomas very hard to understand. I reading Thomas Aquinas in the Summa recently in his section on election, I was kind of startled. Thought I was reading Calvin on election. But at the same time, I can find in Thomas certain elements of stress on the importance of the sacramental system of the Catholic Church, and seems to want to say salvation is by grace. And he does say that. He does say God elects people. But at the same time, there seems to be some slight hesitation to say that shows God's grace fully, that he elects people to salvation without their having to do anything to deserve it.
Right.
Now, I'm not sure I've got Thomas right.
Yeah.
Schaeffer respected Thomas too. He's, of course, one of the great theologians of the Christian church, but I think Schaeffer's concern with Thomas was more the fact that Thomas seemed to think that too much could come from human ingenuity and rationality, whereas Schaeffer, as a Calvinist, sees God's the effect of the sin of mankind as the noetic effect, which means that we don't get things right.
Right.
Everything is mixed up and sinful. And I thought Schaeffer thought that Thomas was just a bit too optimistic there, that there were other ways, and you go as far as you can, and then the Bible sort of takes over and takes you further.
Yeah.
There was a cartoon that came out in Christianity Today a good many years ago, and it showed Peter at the door of heaven with his book, and Francis Schaeffer standing there with his little beard and his knickerbockers. And Peter was looking in his book and saying, Schaeffer, Francis, yes, come in. I think Thomas Aquinas wants a word with you.
Well, that's funny. Now, in a sense that he began to get into the issues of Aquinas as they affected what he believed that they directly affected rationalism. What was your understanding of that? Is that?
Well, I think his take on Thomas Aquinas there was what I was just saying, that Thomas sees the human mind is able to go quite a long way towards salvation. Not all the way, of course, but quite a long way. And Schaeffer felt that that was a mistake.
Yeah.
Too much weight and too much use made of the natural human mind.
Yeah. And so in some ways I guess the approach there of Aquinas would have lent toward the rationalistic approach that basically was trying to find a universal in by natural means. In The God Who Is There, Schaeffer says, I don't think Kirkegaard would be happy or would agree with what has developed from his thinking in either secular or religious existentialism. Yet many people seem to believe Schaeffer was too hard on Kirkegaard, and for implying that his leap of faith concept opened the door to rationalism, and then finally to modernism. And so do you think Dr. Schaeffer was correct on Kierkegaard or merely misunderstood?
That's another big discussion. And it's just about as difficult as trying to understand Thomas Aquinas. I think there were two views of Kirkegaard, and still two views. One is the one Schaeffer took, and that is that Kirkegaard was not so concerned about the historicity of the events of the Bible. So there was a leap of faith. It was more like faith in faith.
Correct.
And that disturbed Schaeffer because he always felt, and I think quite rightly so, that our faith is not a leap of faith. It's Schaeffer would say, a step on the rock. And we do have to make a step. We have to move into another environment, you might say, from our own sinful lives into the context of a Christian life. But it's not a mystical leap.
No.
Where we're not sure where we're going to end up.
Because our mind and intellect are engaged in the process, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Another way, though, to look at Kirkegaard is to appreciate his intensity. You know, he was saying people have to be real Christians. And he couldn't find too much evidence in Denmark of his time that people who claimed to be Christians were living as Christians. So he wanted to make it clear that, as he said, he was a missionary to a Christian nation, trying to convert Christians to the gospel.
Right.
So that side of Kirkegaard is very appealing to us.
Yeah.
Schaeffer didn't talk much about that. He was more concerned with Kierkegaard's lack of commitment to the historicity of the Gospels and of the facts of the Christian life, the virgin birth of Christ, the atoning death of Christ, the resurrection of Christ. Again, Kierkegaard is a tough one to understand, and I don't know that anybody fully understands Kierkegaard.
Yeah. Well, I know one thing that I was taken by is when Jerome Bars in his lectures on Schaeffer talks about that many of the liberal scholars and religious liberal and secular liberal scholars of that time were looking to Kierkegaard, and so it's evidenced in their work that that they're buying into this and then misinterpreting or taking Kierkegaard in places where he probably might not have been taken. How much do you think Dr. Schaeffer's perspective on applying the lordship of Christ to the whole of life was influenced by Abraham Kuyper?
I think Kuyper's influence was strong in Schaeffer's view of reality. Schaeffer didn't talk much about Kuyper. I don't remember his quoting Kuyper too much, but
yeah, I've only
Kuyper's
found one reference myself where in his works where he mentions the great theologian Abraham Kuyper, but he doesn't say much more than that.
But I think the Stone lectures that Kuyper gave at Princeton in, I think it was 1896, on Calvinism. Certainly, as you read those, you can see a lot of connections with Francis Schaeffer's worldview.
Interesting.
And I would say the connection was very strong.
Really? Do you think that touched his politics at all?
Well, he must have.
Possibly.
Not sure quite how to answer that, but Kuyper wanted Christian action, Christian commitment in politics, and so did Schaeffer. Now, whether that took Schaeffer, you might say, too much to a kind of conservative position in terms of American politics, it's hard to say. People would differ on that. There was a part of Schaeffer that was, very much committed to issues of economic justice and racial justice. So I would not see Schaeffer as a right-wing politician.
Correct.
More of a Christian who was trying to apply Christian principles to politics, regardless of what party it might favor.
Excellent. Now, let me ask you this question. What was the greatest impact of the teaching of Dr. Schaeffer on your life?
I think the greatest impact was that Schaeffer opened me up to a more positive view of the world and culture. I grew up at a very strict fundamentalist church and home in South Carolina. And I thank God for that. I mean, that was an important part of my life, to get the foundation that I got in Bible and in Christian living. But that can also be very narrow. And Schaeffer showed me that I could appreciate art and literature and did not have to be so fearful that as a Christian I needed to pull back into a safe place, which is the kind of fundamentalist concept, that I could be more free to serve the Lord in a wider context.
Sure.
So I very much needed that. But you know, when you make that kind of move, you can go too far. You can suddenly say, well, you know, I can do these things that I thought I couldn't do, and go these places, watch these movies, read these books, and if you're not careful, it can begin to take over. But Schaeffer was able to say, you have this freedom, but remember, you're a Christian. And I appreciated the way that he was able to help me become a kind of world Christian without becoming a worldly Christian. It was important. That was the important thing that Schaeffer did for me. The other part of the answer to that question was just his life. He was a very humble man. He didn't put himself up as any great scholar, or very patient, very kind, very gentle.
And to that,
sure, he wasn't perfect, but he's not. In my experience, he was not the kind of man that Francis Schaeffer describes in his books.
Yeah, and that's significant. I think, and one thing I always tell people when I'm talking about that subject is that Dr. Schaeffer, invited people into his home, as well as with his wife Edith, and people lived with him, and they saw the ups and downs, they saw the weak points. It's hard to not to be exposed when people are right there in your own home, and so you're going to get the genuine article. And that's one thing I hear from everybody I talk to that knew him personally, is that he was genuine and he wasn't pretentious, and he was down to earth, and he was just purely about glorifying God. So that's wonderful to hear.
Yeah, I was always impressed with that side of Schaeffer, and particularly his consideration and his kindness. I did meet him again at the second General Assembly of the PCA that met in Macon, Georgia, First Presbyterian Church, and I was living down there at the time, and Francis Schaeffer appeared, and he kind of singled me out and wanted to be with me, and I thought, I don't want to monopolize this great man's time, but he made me feel like he was my friend. That meant a lot.
That's wonderful.
Yeah.
Now, I want to ask you very specifically, is Francis Schaeffer's work still relevant today?
Oh, I think absolutely, yes, and will be. People criticize his work in a lot of different ways. Schaeffer was not a scholar in the academic sense in everything. He talked about art, but he was not an art scholar. He talked about history, he talked about philosophy. He was an evangelist, and he was trying to get it right, and I think most of what Schaeffer said in the broad view of things is correct. But people who are kind of technical in art or literature or something else can point out defects in Schaeffer's thinking. He would admit it himself, but he was not presenting himself as the world's expert on any of these things. But Schaeffer's great ability was to bring it all together and to integrate it. and to show its application to the Christian faith and how the Christian faith could impact these things, and to use that to bring people to Christ.
Yeah, I think when your maxim or your mode of operation is to apply the Lordship of Christ to the whole of life, and then you set about the study of doing so and wish to represent that to others, that's quite a monumental task. And I sometimes think it's miraculous that he was as accurate as he was, just because that there was so much information he had to sift through.
Yes.
Yeah.
We were hoping that the Francis Schaeffer papers would come to Covenant Seminary to the PCA archives. That did not happen. Mm-hmm. Those papers are going to Southeastern Baptist Seminary at Wake Forest. Yeah. And I'm sure they'll do a great job with them, but a little unusual that would end up in a Baptist school. But Schaeffer was, he was not a narrow denominationalist. He was a Presbyterian, but his commitment was to the Christian church worldwide.
One last question I have for you. What would you say to those who are considering reading Dr. Schaeffer for the first time? And I think I have one more I'm going to go ahead and add to that. It's just
I would say read two books, The God Who Is There and True Spirituality at the same time.
Wow.
When you do that, you get Schaeffer the thinker, and you get Schaeffer the man who is endeavoring to live the Christian life and to show other people how to do it. So it's not only how to think, it's how to live.
Yeah.
Those are two parts of Schaeffer's life to me. He was a true Christian in the sense of being an evangelist who wanted to spread the word of Christ, but he also wanted to live a Christian life.
Yeah, he was very pastoral, correct?
Exactly.
Yeah. Well, one last question I just thought I'd better throw in here because I wanted to get what would you say Schaeffer's legacy is? I think sometimes people are trying to figure out just exactly what his thrust was. I mean, if you were to put it into words, and I'm putting you on the spot here, I apologize, but what would you say that his legacy is?
Well, I think his legacy, to me, is more clear in perhaps his earlier life than it became in his later life, when he did get involved pretty deeply in pro-life issues and things like that, which were important. And I think that showed Schaeffer's Christian concerns, and I'm not criticizing him for that. I appreciate what he did there, and I think that legacy lives on. But even greater than that, Schaeffer's legacy to me is this: Christian is a person who tries to serve God in every possible way. It's not, Christianity, being a Christian is not a narrow thing. It's a big thing.
It's a big thing.
And it touches everything. So Christianity is not just a little part of my life, like a Sunday part, and then it doesn't matter Monday through Saturday what I do. Christianity, the Christian faith permeates what we read, what we think, what we say, what we do in life, how we spend our money, how we treat other people. And other people have, of course, said the same thing. But I think Schaeffer was able to say it, particularly in a time when it needed to be said. And I expect that it will always need to be said.
Yeah, it's a constant struggle, I think, for the church to learn to apply the Lordship of Christ in the whole of life and in every situation. And I think that's something that we all should be challenged regularly on, and I appreciate him for that reason too. Well, I want to thank you so much for your time. It's been such a blessing just to speak with you one-on-one and ask you these questions and hear your thoughts. I greatly appreciate your ministry, and to try to look into classes. We have of course, the Covenant Worldwide Classroom, where you can access some of the sermons online, and so had a chance to listen to some of your classes, so it's kind of fun.
Well, thank you, Dan, and I appreciate your work, and I'm glad you and your colleagues are doing this in trying to get the message of Francis Schaeffer out more widely.
Thank you. I appreciate that.